Welcome to One Book, One Coffee. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us today as we explore a truly insightful book. In a world where it's easier to scroll through social media or binge-watch the latest show, you've decided to invest in expanding your knowledge and understanding. It's a remarkable choice, and it says a lot about your curiosity and willingness to learn. Today, we're diving into Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram, a book that has long influenced our understanding of human behavior. This isn't just a book about experiments. It's a profound exploration of how ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts under orders. It's been hailed as essential reading by notable figures across various fields, though specific endorsements from today's public figures are scarce. Its impact is universally acknowledged among psychologists and scholars. Stanley Milgram, a groundbreaking social psychologist, conducted these experiments during a time of social upheaval in the 1960s. His work was driven by a deep curiosity about the mechanisms of authority and conformity, shaped significantly by the context of the post-World War II era and his personal reflections on human nature. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed, chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. The Nature of Obedience. Stanley Milgram was a pioneering social psychologist known for his research into authority and obedience. Influenced by the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust, Milgram sought to understand how ordinary people could commit extraordinary acts when instructed by authority figures. His personal and professional journey through the social tensions of the 1960s shaped obedience to authority, leaving a lasting impact on psychological studies and ethical discussions. Picture this. You're settling into your favorite coffee shop, steam rising from your cup when someone asks you a simple question that stops you cold. How far would you go if someone in authority told you to hurt another person? Your immediate response might be something like, "Not very far at all. I'd never do that." And honestly, that's probably what most of us would say. But Stanley Milgram, a brilliant social psychologist in the 1960s, was about to shatter that comfortable assumption in ways that still send chills down our spines today. Milgram wasn't just some academic sitting in an ivory tower pondering human nature. He was a man haunted by one of history's darkest chapters. The Holocaust had ended less than 20 years before he began his research, and the world was still grappling with an impossible question. How could ordinary people, neighbors and shopkeepers and teachers, participate in such unthinkable horrors? The easy answer was that the Nazis were somehow fundamentally different, that they were monsters wearing human masks. But Milgram suspected something far more unsettling might be true. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times a day do you follow orders without really questioning them? Your boss asks you to stay late, you do it. A police officer tells you to move along, you comply. A doctor prescribes medication, you take it. This isn't necessarily bad, it's actually how society functions. We live in a world built on hierarchies and authority structures, and most of the time that works pretty well. But Milgram wondered, where does healthy obedience end and dangerous compliance begin? The seeds of his famous experiments were planted during his time at Yale University, where he was surrounded by brilliant minds all wrestling with the same fundamental questions about human nature. But Milgram wasn't content to just theorize. He wanted to create a laboratory setting where he could actually observe obedience in action, where he could strip away all the complex variables of real-world situations and see what people would actually do when authority and conscience collided head-on. Now imagine you're responding to a newspaper ad for a psychology experiment about learning and memory. Seems harmless enough, right? You show up at Yale University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, and you're greeted by a serious-looking researcher in a white lab coat. The setting itself communicates authority and legitimacy. This isn't some sketchy operation. This is science conducted at Yale by people who clearly know what they're doing. Milgram understood something profound about human psychology that many of us prefer not to think about. Context shapes behavior in ways we rarely acknowledge. The same person who might refuse to hurt someone on the street might behave completely differently when that same action is framed as part of a scientific experiment, sanctioned by a respected institution, and requested by someone in a position of legitimate authority. But here's where Milgram's genius really shines through. He wasn't just interested in whether people would obey. He was fascinated by the psychological mechanisms that make obedience possible. What happens in our minds when we shift from being autonomous individuals to agents of someone else's will? How do we rationalize actions that contradict our moral instincts? These questions feel just as relevant today as they did 60 years ago. Consider our modern world for a moment. We have corporate whistleblowers who risk everything to expose wrongdoing, but we also have countless employees who stay silent about practices they know are harmful. We have citizens who stand up to government overreach, but we also have people who follow orders they privately question. We have healthcare workers who advocate fiercely for their patients, but we also have systems where institutional pressure can override individual judgment. The beauty of Milgram's approach was that he wasn't trying to prove that people are inherently evil or inherently good. He was trying to understand the situational factors that can tip us in either direction. And that's what makes his work so valuable for all of us today. Because once we understand these mechanisms, once we recognize the subtle ways that authority can override our moral compass, we're better equipped to make conscious choices about when to comply and when to resist. What Milgram was really asking, and what we're still grappling with today, is this: how do we maintain our individual moral agency in a world that requires cooperation and hierarchy to function? It's not a simple question with a simple answer, but it's one that every thinking person needs to wrestle with. As we dive deeper into Milgram's groundbreaking experiments, we're not just exploring a fascinating piece of psychology history. We're examining the very foundations of how we navigate authority, responsibility, and moral choice in our daily lives. So grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare to question some assumptions you might not even know you had. Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile laboratory at Yale University in the early 1960s, and a man in a white coat tells you to deliver what you believe are painful electric shocks to another human being. The person receiving the shocks is pleading for you to stop, but the authority figure calmly insists you must continue. What do? This isn't science fiction or some twisted game show. This was the reality that hundreds of ordinary people faced in Stanley Milgram's groundbreaking experiments, and it reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature that we're still grappling with today. Milgram didn't set out to prove that people are inherently cruel. He was trying to understand something that haunted an entire generation. How did ordinary Germans become complicit in the Holocaust? How do regular people, who consider themselves moral and decent, end up participating in acts of unthinkable cruelty? The answer, as his experiments would reveal, lies in the fundamental tension between our personal conscience and our deeply ingrained tendency to obey authority. Now think about this for a moment. From the time we're toddlers, we're taught to listen to authority figures. Parents, teachers, police officers, doctors, bosses, society functions, because we generally follow the guidance of those in positions of power. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Imagine the chaos if everyone decided traffic lights were merely suggestions, or if patients ignored their doctor's advice. But here's where it gets complicated. What happens when that same obedience mechanism that keeps society running smoothly is hijacked by malevolent forces? Milgram's participants weren't monsters. They were teachers, postal workers, engineers, and salespeople, people just like you and me. Yet when placed in his experimental situation, a staggering 65% of them administered what they believed were potentially lethal shocks to an innocent person. They did this not because they enjoyed causing pain, but because a scientist in a lab coat told them it was necessary for the experiment to continue. The genius of Milgram's design was in how it gradually escalated the conflict between conscience and obedience. It started innocuously enough, just a small shock for a wrong answer. But with each mistake, the voltage increased, and the victims' protests grew more desperate. Participants found themselves trapped in what psychologists call a commitment trap. Having agreed to participate and already delivered several shocks, backing out would mean admitting they had been wrong to start. The authority figure provided a convenient escape from personal responsibility. The experiment requires that you continue, or you have no choice but to go on. This dynamic plays out in our modern world more often than we'd like to admit. Consider the corporate whistleblower who knows their company is cutting dangerous corners but stays silent because their boss assures them it's industry standard. Think about the nurse who questions a doctor's order but administers the medication anyway because challenging medical authority feels impossible. Or picture the employee who participates in discriminatory practices because that's just how we do things here. What makes Milgram's findings so chilling is how they reveal the conditions that make obedience almost inevitable. Physical proximity to authority matters enormously. When the experimenter gave orders by telephone rather than standing in the room, obedience dropped dramatically. The legitimacy of the institution played a crucial role too. When the experiment was moved from prestigious Yale to a rundown office building, fewer people complied. Most importantly, the presence or absence of others who were willing to dissent made all the difference. When participants saw Confederates refuse to continue, they found the courage to stop as well. Here's what's particularly relevant for us today. We live in an age where authority figures are everywhere, but they're often invisible or diffused. Algorithms determine what we see on social media. Corporate policies shape our daily behaviors. Government regulations influence our choices. The authority figures in our lives might not wear white coats, but they're no less powerful for being hidden behind screens and bureaucratic structures. The dilemma of obedience isn't just about dramatic situations like war crimes or corporate scandals. It shows up in everyday moments when we choose conformity over conscience. It's the meeting where everyone nods along with a decision they privately disagree with. It's the social media post we don't challenge even though we know it's spreading misinformation. It's the 1,000 small compromises we make because standing up to authority feels too risky, too uncomfortable, or too lonely. But here's the hopeful part of Milgram's legacy. Understanding these dynamics gives us power over them. When we recognize the psychological forces at play, we can prepare ourselves to resist them. We can build cultures that encourage dissent and questioning. We can create systems with checks and balances that prevent any single authority from having too much power. The most profound lesson from Milgram's work isn't that humans are inherently obedient or cruel. It's that our moral choices are profoundly shaped by the situations we find ourselves in. And if situations can push us toward harmful obedience, they can also be designed to encourage moral courage and independent thinking. Picture this. You're walking into a Yale University psychology lab in the early 1960s, thinking you're about to participate in a simple study about learning and memory. You've answered a newspaper ad that promised $4 for an hour of your time, decent money back then. But what you're actually walking into is one of the most revealing experiments about human nature ever conducted, one that would forever change how we understand the dark side of obedience. Stanley Milgram had a burning question that haunted him, as it haunted many people in the aftermath of World War II. How could ordinary Germans have participated in the Holocaust? Were they fundamentally different from the rest of us? Or was there something about the situation itself that could transform regular people into instruments of cruelty? To find out, Milgram designed an experiment so elegantly simple yet psychologically complex that it continues to send chills down our spines today. Here's how it worked. When you arrived at the lab, you'd meet two other people, a stern-looking experimenter in a gray lab coat, and another participant who seemed friendly enough. The experimenter would explain that this was a study about the effects of punishment on learning. One of you would be the teacher, the other the learner. What you didn't know was that the whole thing was an elaborate theater production, and you were the only real participant. The friendly fellow participant was actually an actor, and the experimenter was in on it too. Through what appeared to be a random drawing but was actually rigged, you'd always end up as the teacher. Your job seemed straightforward enough. Read word pairs to the learner, then test their memory. When they got an answer wrong, you deliver an electric shock as punishment, increasing the voltage with each mistake. The learner would be strapped into what looked like an electric chair in an adjacent room, connected to a formidable shock generator. And what a machine this was! Milgram had commissioned a realistic-looking device with 30 switches, each labeled with voltage levels starting at 15 volts and climbing in 15-volt increments all the way up to 450 volts. The switches were grouped under labels that grew increasingly ominous. Slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, most chillingly, XXX beyond 420 volts. Now think about this. You're sitting in front of this intimidating machine, and the experimenter is calmly explaining that while the shocks may be painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. The learner mentions casually that he has a heart condition, but is assured it won't be a problem. Everything seems scientific and legitimate. After all, this is Yale University. These people are experts. They must know what they're doing, right? The experiment would begin innocuously enough. The learner in the next room would get some answers right, some wrong. For each wrong answer, you'd flip a switch and hear what sounded like an electric shock being delivered, followed by a grunt or mild complaint from the learner. But as the voltage climbed and the mistakes continued, something remarkable and disturbing would unfold. The actor playing the learner had rehearsed a carefully scripted series of responses. At first, just mild expressions of discomfort. But as the supposed voltage increased, his reactions would escalate dramatically. He'd start complaining about the pain, then demanding to be released, then screaming in agony, pounding on the walls, crying out about his heart condition. Eventually, after the highest shocks, he would fall completely silent, a silence more terrifying than his screams. But here's where Milgram's genius really shows. Whenever you, the teacher, would hesitate or express concern about continuing, the experimenter had a series of prods ready. First, a simple please continue. If you balked again, the experiment requires that you continue. Then, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice, you must go on. These weren't threats or physical coercion. Just calm, authoritative statements from someone in a lab coat. Yet these simple words possessed an almost hypnotic power over ordinary people. The experimenter never raised his voice, never mentioned consequences for stopping. He simply projected the quiet confidence of scientific authority. Think about how this mirrors situations in our own lives. How often do we find ourselves following orders or going along with things that make us uncomfortable, simply because someone in a position of authority tells us to? Whether it's a boss asking us to cut ethical corners, a doctor whose judgment we don't question, or even a GPS that leads us down an obviously wrong path, we constantly navigate this tension between our own moral compass and the pressure to obey. What Milgram discovered in that sterile Yale laboratory wasn't just an abstract psychological principle. It was a mirror reflecting something fundamental about human nature that we're still grappling with today. The setup was deceptively simple, but what it revealed about ordinary people's capacity for both cruelty and resistance would shake the foundations of how we understand ourselves and the societies we create. Picture this. You're Stanley Milgram in 1961, sitting in your Yale laboratory, absolutely convinced you're about to prove something reassuring about human nature. You've designed this elaborate experiment where ordinary people are asked to deliver electric shocks to strangers, and you're thinking, Well, this will be interesting, but obviously most people will refuse to hurt someone else. You've even consulted with psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults, asking them to predict what would happen. The consensus: maybe 1 or 2 people out of 100 would go all the way to the maximum shock level. After all, this is America, not Nazi Germany. We're independent thinkers, right? But then the results start rolling in, and suddenly Milgram finds himself staring at numbers that make absolutely no sense. Instead of the predicted 1 or 2%, a staggering 65% of his subjects went all the way to 450 volts. 65%. Think about that for a moment. If you were in a room with 10 random people from your neighborhood, your workplace, your church, 6 or 7 of them would potentially deliver what they believed were dangerous, possibly lethal electric shocks to a complete stranger, simply because someone in a lab coat told them to continue. Now, imagine being Milgram in that moment. You've just discovered something about human nature that nobody saw coming, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about moral behavior and individual autonomy. It's like expecting to find a puddle and instead discovering an ocean. The sheer magnitude of obedience wasn't just surprising, it was genuinely shocking, if you'll pardon the expression. What made these results even more bewildering was who these people were. They weren't monsters or sociopaths. They were teachers, engineers, postal workers, salespeople, regular folks who probably helped their neighbors, loved their families, and considered themselves decent human beings. Many of them were visibly distressed during the experiment, sweating, trembling, even laughing nervously as they continued to flip those switches. They clearly didn't want to hurt anyone, yet they kept going. It was as if there were 2 different people inside each subject: the moral individual who knew this was wrong, and the obedient participant who couldn't seem to stop following orders. Here's where it gets really fascinating. Milgram had expected that education, intelligence, and social class would serve as protective factors against blind obedience. Surely, he thought, the more educated subjects would be more likely to resist. But the data told a different story entirely. College graduates were just as likely to obey as high school dropouts. Professionals showed the same compliance rates as blue-collar workers. It was like discovering that umbrellas don't actually protect you from rain, that everything you thought you knew about human psychology was built on sand. Think about this in terms of our modern world. How many times have you found yourself going along with something at work that didn't feel quite right, simply because your boss insisted, or following a policy that seemed questionable because that's just how we do things here? Milgram's unexpected results suggest that this tendency runs much deeper than we'd like to admit. We're not talking about dramatic scenarios involving lab coats and shock machines. We're talking about the everyday moments when authority figures ask us to bend our principles, and we discover that our resistance isn't nearly as strong as we imagined. The most unsettling aspect of these results wasn't just the high compliance rate, but how normal the whole process appeared. Subjects didn't transform into raging sadists. They remained polite, respectful, even apologetic as they administered what they believed were increasingly dangerous shocks. They would turn to the experimenter and say things like, "Should I really continue? He seems to be in pain." But when told that the experiment required them to go on, they did. It was obedience wrapped in civility, compliance disguised as cooperation. Consider how this plays out in corporate environments today. How many financial scandals, environmental disasters, or ethical breaches happen not because people are inherently evil, but because they're following orders from authority figures. The unexpected nature of Milgram's results forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The capacity for harmful obedience isn't some rare psychological aberration. It's woven into the fabric of how we relate to authority, how we navigate social hierarchies, and how we balance our individual moral compass against external pressures. What makes these findings so relevant today is that we live in an increasingly complex world filled with authority figures, experts, and institutions all claiming to know what's best. From social media algorithms that shape our thinking to corporate cultures that demand conformity, we're constantly navigating situations where our personal judgment comes into conflict with external authority. Milgram's unexpected results serve as a wake-up call, reminding us that our capacity for independent moral reasoning might be more fragile than we'd like to believe, and that understanding this vulnerability is the first step toward protecting ourselves and others from its potentially devastating consequences. Picture this. You're a scientist who's just discovered something that shakes you to your core about human nature. What do you do next? If you're Stanley Milgram, you don't just accept your shocking findings and move on. Instead, you become like a master chef experimenting with a recipe, tweaking one ingredient at a time to see exactly what makes the dish work. And that's precisely what Milgram did after his initial obedience experiments left him staring into the abyss of human compliance. Now think about this for a moment. When you first hear about Milgram's basic experiment, where ordinary people delivered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers, your mind probably races to find explanations. Maybe it was just the particular setup, you might think. Maybe it was the authority figure in the white lab coat, or the prestigious Yale setting, or perhaps something unique about the participants themselves. Milgram had the same questions, and like any good detective, he systematically changed one variable at a time to see what would happen. Let's start with something that might surprise you. What if the authority figure wasn't physically present in the room? Imagine you're alone with just the learner, and the experimenter gives you instructions over the phone. Surely, you'd be more likely to refuse, right? Well, Milgram tested this, and while obedience did drop significantly, it's remarkable that anyone complied at all when the authority was just a voice on the telephone. It's like the difference between your boss standing over your shoulder versus sending you an email. Yet some people still followed orders that went against their moral compass, even with that distance. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Milgram discovered that proximity played a crucial role, but not always in the way you'd expect. When the learner was moved closer to the teacher, when they could see the person supposedly receiving the shocks, obedience rates dropped. It's much harder to harm someone when you can see their face, hear their protests clearly, and witness their apparent suffering. This reminds me of how much easier it is to be cruel in online comments than face-to-face conversations. Distance, whether physical or psychological, seems to act like a moral anesthetic. The most dramatic variation involved what Milgram called the touch proximity condition. Here, participants had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate. Picture having to grab someone's hand and push it down onto what you believe is an electrified surface. The obedience rate plummeted to 30%, yet even then, nearly 1 in 3 people still complied. Think about that. Nearly 1 in 3 people were willing to physically force another human being to receive what they believed were painful electric shocks, simply because an authority figure told them to do so. Now, you might wonder about the setting itself. Yale University carries enormous prestige and authority. What would happen if you moved the experiment to a rundown office building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, with no institutional backing? Surprisingly, while obedience rates did decrease, they didn't collapse entirely. It's as if the mere presence of someone claiming scientific authority was enough to maintain a significant level of compliance, regardless of the shabby surroundings. This tells us something profound about how we respond to perceived expertise and authority, even when the trappings are less impressive. Perhaps most intriguingly, Milgram experimented with having multiple authority figures who disagreed with each other. Imagine 2 experimenters arguing about whether to continue the procedure. In these situations, obedience virtually disappeared. It's like watching your parents argue about household rules. Suddenly, you realize the authority isn't absolute and unified, and you feel free to make your own choices. This variation reveals something crucial about how authority works. It's most powerful when it appears united and certain. The variations also explored what happened when ordinary participants, not authority figures, were the ones giving orders. When fellow participants suggested increasing the shock levels, compliance was minimal. We seem hardwired to respond differently to perceived, legitimate authority versus peer pressure. It's the difference between a police officer directing traffic and a random person on the street telling you which way to drive. These experiments paint a picture that's both troubling and enlightening. They show us that obedience isn't just about following orders. It's about a complex web of factors including physical proximity, institutional authority, the unity of command, and our psychological distance from the consequences of our actions. In our modern world, think about how these principles play out in corporate environments where harmful decisions are made through chains of command, or in online spaces where anonymity creates distance from the human impact of our words and actions. As we move forward in exploring Milgram's work, these variations remind us that understanding human behavior isn't about finding simple explanations, but about recognizing the intricate dance between situation and character. The question isn't whether we're good or bad people, but rather how the circumstances around us shape our choices in ways we might never expect. And perhaps most importantly, these findings suggest that by understanding these influences, we might be better equipped to resist them when our conscience calls us to do so. So we've seen the shocking results of Milgram's experiments, but now comes the really fascinating part. Why do we obey authority in the first place? Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, and you notice how naturally people form lines, how they wait their turn, how they respond when the barista calls out orders. There's something almost magical about how smoothly society functions, and at the heart of it all is this mysterious thing we call obedience to authority. Milgram wasn't just interested in documenting obedience. He wanted to understand its very essence. Think about it for a moment. Obedience is everywhere in our lives, yet we rarely stop to examine what it actually is or why it exists. It's like breathing, so fundamental that we take it for granted until something goes wrong. Here's where Milgram's thinking gets really interesting. He argued that obedience to authority isn't some character flaw or sign of weakness. It's actually a survival mechanism that's been hardwired into us through millions of years of evolution. Imagine early human societies without any form of organized authority. Picture the chaos. No coordinated hunting, no shared defense against predators, no way to organize the complex tasks needed for survival. Those groups that developed systems of authority and obedience thrived, while those that didn't simply disappeared into the mists of prehistory. But here's the twist that makes this so relevant to our modern world. The very mechanism that helped our ancestors survive has become something of a double-edged sword in contemporary society. We still carry these ancient patterns of deference to authority, but we're now living in a world where authority figures aren't necessarily looking out for our survival. They might be selling us something, manipulating us, or worse. Milgram identified what he called the Agentic State, a psychological condition where people essentially switch off their own moral compass and become agents of someone else's will. It's like temporarily handing over the keys to your conscience to another person. Now, think about how often this happens in your daily life. When your boss asks you to do something questionable, when a police officer gives you instructions, when a doctor recommends a treatment. In these moments, we often slip into this agentic state without even realizing it. The fascinating thing is how quickly this transformation can occur. Milgram observed that people could switch from being autonomous moral agents to obedient followers in a matter of seconds. One moment they're thinking for themselves, weighing options, considering consequences. The next moment, they're simply following orders. It's like watching someone flip a psychological switch. Consider how this plays out in our modern workplaces. You might be the most ethical person in the world when you're at home with your family, but put on that corporate uniform, sit at that desk, and suddenly you're operating under a completely different set of rules. You're not John or Sarah anymore, you're an employee, a representative, an agent of the organization. Your individual moral framework gets temporarily suspended in favor of the institutional one. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Imagine if every employee in every organization constantly questioned every directive and made their own independent decisions about what to do. Society would grind to a halt. But here's where it gets tricky. How do we maintain the benefits of organized cooperation while avoiding the dangers of blind obedience? Milgram also explored what he called legitimacy of authority, the idea that we're more likely to obey someone we perceive as having legitimate power over us. But here's a question that's more relevant today than ever. Who gets to decide what makes authority legitimate? In Milgram's experiments, people obeyed a scientist in a lab coat, but they probably wouldn't have obeyed the same person if he'd been wearing a clown costume. The authority was partly in the role, partly in the setting, and partly in our own minds. Think about how this applies to our digital age. We obey the algorithms that curate our social media feeds. We follow the recommendations of influencers we've never met. We comply with terms of service agreements we never read. The lab coat has been replaced by blue checkmarks, follower counts, and sophisticated interfaces, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably similar. What makes Milgram's insights so enduring is that he recognized obedience as neither inherently good nor inherently evil. It's a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on how it's used. The same psychological mechanism that enables a surgeon to coordinate with their team to save a life can also enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. Understanding these theoretical underpinnings doesn't just satisfy our intellectual curiosity. It gives us practical wisdom for navigating our daily lives. When we recognize the signs of slipping into an agentic state, when we understand how authority derives its power, when we see the evolutionary roots of our own compliance, we become more conscious participants in the dance between autonomy and obedience that shapes our world. And that awareness, as we'll see, becomes the foundation for developing what Milgram would call informed resistance, the ability to choose when to obey and when to stand firm in our own moral convictions. You know, we've been talking about Milgram's shocking discoveries about how ordinary people can become agents of harm, but now we need to pause and ask ourselves a really uncomfortable question. Was it okay for him to put people through this in the first place? Picture yourself sitting in that Yale laboratory, thinking you're helping with a learning experiment, only to discover later that you've been the real subject all along, manipulated into believing you were torturing another human being. How would that make you feel? This brings us to one of the most heated debates in psychology, and frankly, one that still rages today whenever we talk about research ethics. Milgram himself was deeply aware of the moral minefield he had entered. Think about it like this. Imagine you're a doctor who discovers a cure for a terrible disease, but to test it, you have to put healthy volunteers through an incredibly traumatic experience. The question becomes whether the knowledge gained justifies the harm inflicted along the way. The participants in Milgram's experiments didn't just walk away with a simple, "Thank you for your time." Many of them left that laboratory fundamentally shaken about who they thought they were. One businessman later described feeling like he had discovered a monster living inside himself. A housewife talked about questioning her own moral compass for months afterward. These weren't just temporary inconveniences we're talking about. These were profound psychological wounds that challenged people's very sense of self. Now, Milgram would argue, and did argue passionately, that his research revealed something so crucial about human nature that it had to be done. He'd point to the Holocaust, to My Lai, to countless other atrocities throughout history where ordinary people became complicit in evil, and he'd say, how can we prevent these horrors if we don't understand how they happen? It's a compelling argument, isn't it? The idea that sometimes we have to inflict smaller harms to prevent much larger ones. But here's where it gets really complicated. The participants in his experiments were deceived on multiple levels. They thought they were helping with research on learning and memory. They believed the learner was a fellow volunteer when he was actually an actor. They were told the shocks were real when they weren't. And perhaps most importantly, they weren't given the chance to make an informed decision about whether they wanted to participate in a study that would test their willingness to harm another person. Think about this in terms of modern consent. Today, we're incredibly careful about making sure people understand what they're signing up for. When you download an app, you get those endless terms and conditions. When you visit a doctor, you're told about every possible side effect. But Milgram's participants were essentially tricked into revealing their darkest psychological tendencies without ever agreeing to that level of exposure. The American Psychological Association actually tightened their ethical guidelines largely because of experiments like Milgram's. They established principles that seem obvious now but were revolutionary then. Informed consent, the right to withdraw at any time, protection from psychological harm, and thorough debriefing. It's like how we now have safety regulations for cars because of all the accidents that happened before we understood the importance of seatbelts and airbags. But here's what makes this debate so fascinating and relevant today. We're living in an era where technology companies conduct massive psychological experiments on us every single day. When Facebook manipulates your news feed to see how it affects your mood, when Instagram changes its algorithm to test user engagement, when dating apps experiment with your matches to study relationship formation, are these really so different from what Milgram did? The scale is bigger. The consent is buried in terms of service agreements most people never read, and the psychological impact, while perhaps less intense per person, affects millions. Milgram himself tried to address these concerns. He followed up with his participants, conducting interviews and surveys to assess their long-term psychological state. Surprisingly, many reported that despite the initial distress, they were ultimately glad they had participated because they learned something important about themselves and human nature. It's like that old saying about how the most valuable lessons are often the most painful ones. The question that haunts researchers and ethicists to this day is whether there could have been another way to gain these insights without the deception and psychological distress. Could Milgram have achieved the same revelations through role-playing scenarios where people knew they were acting, through careful observation of real-world situations, through historical analysis? Some argue that the very authenticity of the participants' responses, their genuine belief that they were causing harm, was essential to understanding the psychology of obedience. As we wrap up this thorny ethical discussion, it's worth remembering that the debate itself is part of Milgram's legacy. His experiments didn't just reveal uncomfortable truths about human obedience. They forced us to confront equally uncomfortable questions about the price of knowledge and the responsibility we have to protect each other, even in the pursuit of greater understanding. And perhaps that conversation, difficult as it is, represents its own form of moral progress. Picture this. You're sitting in a coffee shop, and you notice how effortlessly the barista follows the manager's instructions, even when asked to remake a perfectly good latte for the third time. There's something almost automatic about it, isn't there? This simple observation actually opens the door to one of the most unsettling discoveries in psychology, something Stanley Milgram called the Agentic State. And trust me, once you understand this concept, you'll see it everywhere. Now, think about this for a moment. What happens to your sense of personal responsibility when someone in authority tells you what to do? Milgram discovered something that should make us all pause over our morning coffee. When we perceive ourselves as agents carrying out another person's wishes, we essentially undergo a psychological transformation. We shift from what he called an autonomous state, where we feel fully responsible for our actions, into an agentic state, where we see ourselves merely as instruments of someone else's will. The beauty and terror of Milgram's insight lies in how natural this transformation feels. Imagine you're a participant in his famous experiment. You walk into that sterile laboratory at Yale University, and immediately the environment signals authority. The scientist in the white coat, the impressive equipment, the institutional setting, everything screams legitimacy. When that scientist tells you to continue administering what you believe are electric shocks to another person, something fascinating happens in your mind. You don't necessarily become cruel or sadistic. Instead, you slip into a mental state where you're no longer Stanley or Sarah making independent choices. You become the person following the scientist's protocol. This agentic state operates like a psychological switch, and once it's flipped, the rules of moral decision-making change dramatically. Think about how a soldier can perform actions in war that would be unthinkable in civilian life, or how corporate employees can implement policies they personally find questionable. They're not necessarily bad people. They're people who have entered this agentic state where personal moral agency takes a backseat to hierarchical obedience. But here's where it gets really interesting and somewhat chilling. Milgram found that people in the agentic state don't lose their moral sensibilities entirely. They still feel uncomfortable. They still experience stress and conflict. Many of his participants were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, even laughing nervously. Yet they continued. Why? Because in the agentic state, the discomfort becomes about disappointing the authority figure or disrupting the system, not about the harm they might be causing. Let me paint you a picture that might hit closer to home. Consider the modern workplace where we see the agentic state in action every day. An employee receives instructions to cut costs, knowing it means laying off colleagues who have families to support. The employee feels terrible about it, loses sleep, maybe even questions the decision privately. But when Monday morning comes, they implement the policy anyway. They've entered that agentic state where they see themselves as simply carrying out organizational directives, not as individuals making moral choices. The most unsettling aspect of Milgram's discovery is how this state protects us from the full weight of our actions. When we're agents rather than autonomous actors, we can maintain our self-image as good people while participating in harmful systems. It's a psychological defense mechanism that allows us to live with ourselves, but at what cost? Now, think about this in our current digital age. How many social media content moderators spend their days removing disturbing content, following company guidelines even when they personally disagree with the decisions? How many data analysts compile reports that they know will be used to manipulate consumer behavior? The agentic state doesn't require a white lab coat or a university setting. It emerges wherever there's a clear hierarchy and legitimate-seeming authority. But here's the crucial insight that Milgram offers us, and it's both sobering and empowering. Recognizing the agentic state is the first step to resisting it. When we understand how easily we slip into this mode of thinking, we can develop what I like to call moral vigilance. We can learn to pause and ask ourselves, am I making this choice as an autonomous individual, or am I simply following orders because someone with authority told me to? The practical wisdom here isn't to reject all authority. That would be chaos. Instead, it's about maintaining what Milgram called moral agency, even within hierarchical structures. It's about remembering that I was just following orders has never been an adequate moral defense, whether we're talking about historical atrocities or everyday ethical compromises. As we move forward in our exploration of obedience and authority, keep this concept of the agentic state in your back pocket. It's a lens that will help us understand not just Milgram's shocking experimental results, but the countless ways we navigate power structures in our own lives. Because the question isn't whether you'll encounter situations that trigger the agentic state. You will. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it happens. Picture this. You're sitting in a doctor's office, and the physician in the crisp white coat tells you to take a medication that seems questionable. What do? Or imagine your boss asks you to implement a policy that feels ethically murky. How do you respond? These everyday scenarios reveal something profound about human nature that Stanley Milgram uncovered in his groundbreaking research, something that might make you question everything you thought you knew about your own moral compass. Milgram's exploration of authority figures isn't just academic theory gathering dust on university shelves. It's a mirror held up to our daily lives, reflecting back uncomfortable truths about how we navigate the complex web of power structures that surround us from morning to night. Think about it for a moment. How many times today did you follow someone's direction simply because they held a position of authority? The traffic officer directing cars, the airline pilot's instructions over the intercom, your manager's email marked urgent. We live in a world where authority shapes our choices more than we'd like to admit. What Milgram discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. Authority figures don't just influence our decisions through force or explicit threats. Instead, they tap into something much deeper, something woven into the fabric of how we understand our place in society. It's like an invisible current running through our social interactions, powerful enough to override our personal moral judgments in ways that would shock us if we truly understood their reach. Consider the white coat phenomenon that Milgram observed. When someone wears the symbols of authority, whether it's a lab coat, a uniform, or even just a title on a business card, something shifts in how we perceive them, and more importantly, how we perceive ourselves in relation to them. It's as if we unconsciously step into a different role, one where our usual moral calculations get recalibrated. The person in the white coat becomes the expert, the one who knows better, the one whose judgment supersedes our own. Now, think about this. How often do you question the recommendations of someone simply because they're wearing scrubs or carrying a clipboard? But here's where Milgram's insights become truly eye-opening. Authority doesn't just command through expertise or knowledge. It operates through what he called the agentic state, a psychological condition where we essentially hand over our moral agency to someone else. We stop seeing ourselves as the primary decision-maker and instead become an agent carrying out someone else's will. It's like switching from being the driver of your own car to becoming a passenger, trusting someone else to navigate the moral terrain. This shift happens so smoothly, so naturally, that we barely notice it occurring. One moment you're making your own choices based on your own values, and the next moment you're following orders that you might never have considered if they came from a peer or a subordinate. The transformation isn't dramatic or obvious. It's more like slipping into a warm bath, where the change in temperature is so gradual you don't realize how different the environment has become until you're completely immersed. What makes this particularly relevant in our modern world is how authority has evolved and multiplied. We're no longer just dealing with traditional figures like teachers, police officers, or government officials. Today, we navigate multiple layers of authority simultaneously. There's the algorithm that decides what news we see, the influencer whose lifestyle choices we unconsciously mirror, the app that tracks our steps and tells us when we're being healthy. Each of these represents a different kind of authority figure, one that shapes our behavior in subtle but powerful ways. The workplace offers perhaps the most vivid contemporary example of Milgram's insights in action. How many corporate scandals could be traced back to employees who knew something was wrong but followed orders anyway? The financial crisis of 2008, various environmental disasters, data privacy breaches, all of these often involve ordinary people who set aside their personal judgment in deference to institutional authority. They weren't necessarily bad people making evil choices. They were people caught in the powerful current of organizational hierarchy, swept along by forces they might not have even recognized. But here's the hopeful part of Milgram's message, the part that makes this research empowering rather than just disturbing. Understanding how authority works gives us the tools to recognize when we're slipping into that agentic state. It's like learning to spot the undertow at the beach. Once you know what to look for, you can swim more safely. When we become aware of how authority figures influence our thinking, we can pause and ask ourselves crucial questions. Am I following this direction because it makes sense, or simply because of who's giving it? What would I do if this same request came from someone without any formal authority over me? This awareness doesn't mean we should reject all authority or become perpetual rebels. Authority serves important functions in organizing society and enabling cooperation on a massive scale. But Milgram's work teaches us that healthy skepticism and moral independence aren't signs of disrespect or insubordination. They're essential tools for maintaining our humanity in a world where power structures can easily overwhelm our individual conscience. As we'll explore next, this dynamic becomes even more complex when we examine how ordinary people can be transformed by the very systems they're meant to serve. You know how we've been exploring the dark psychology behind Milgram's shocking experiments, where ordinary people delivered what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. Well, here's where things get really fascinating and perhaps even more unsettling. Milgram didn't just conduct his experiments in one place and call it a day. He took his research across cultures, and what he discovered about how different societies respond to authority will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature and cultural values. Picture this: you're sitting in a cafe in Munich, then teleporting to a bustling street in Rome, then finding yourself in a quiet university town in Australia. Same experiment, same white lab coats, same authoritative commands, but completely different cultural backdrops. Now think about this. Would you expect people from these vastly different societies to respond the same way to authority? Your gut might say no, but the reality is far more complex and troubling than you might imagine. When Milgram replicated his obedience studies across different countries, he uncovered patterns that read like a cultural psychology thriller. In Germany, where the shadow of Nazi authoritarianism still loomed large in the collective memory, you might expect people to be more resistant to blindly following orders. After all, this was a society that had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic consequences of unquestioning obedience. Yet the results were surprisingly similar to the American baseline, with obedience rates hovering around that same chilling 65% mark that had shocked the world. But here's where it gets interesting. The German participants didn't just comply, they did so with a particular style that reflected their cultural conditioning. They were more formal, more methodical, almost ritualistic in their approach to following the experimenters' commands. It was as if the very cultural traits that had enabled authoritarian control in the past were still embedded in the social fabric, like invisible threads that could be pulled by anyone wearing the right costume of authority. Now let's hop over to Italy, where Milgram found something that might surprise you. In a culture often stereotyped as more emotional and individualistic, you'd think people might be more likely to rebel against cold, scientific authority. But here's the twist: Italian participants showed similar overall compliance rates, though their path to obedience looked dramatically different. They were more expressive, more conflicted, more likely to argue and question, but ultimately they still pressed those switches. It was like watching someone have an emotional wrestling match with their conscience and losing. Think about what this tells us about the universal nature of authority. It's not that Italians were less moral or Germans were more prone to authoritarianism. Instead, Milgram was uncovering something far more fundamental about how human beings are wired to respond to legitimate authority, regardless of their cultural programming. The expression of that obedience might vary, the emotional journey might be different, but the end result remained remarkably consistent across vastly different societies. Consider how this plays out in our modern globalized world. You see the same patterns everywhere, just dressed in different cultural clothing. In corporate boardrooms in Tokyo, employees bow deeply and follow directives that might seem questionable. In Silicon Valley startups, young programmers work 100-hour weeks because a charismatic CEO tells them they're changing the world. In traditional societies, people follow religious or tribal authorities even when it conflicts with their personal beliefs. The uniforms change, the language changes, the rituals change, but that fundamental human tendency to submit to authority remains constant. What's particularly chilling is how these cultural variations reveal that obedience isn't just about fear or coercion. In many cases, it's about belonging, about maintaining one's place in the social fabric. The German participants weren't afraid of the experimenter. They were fulfilling what they saw as their duty. The Italian participants weren't mindless robots. They were struggling with competing values and ultimately choosing social compliance over personal conviction. This cross-cultural research also exposed something crucial about how we rationalize our obedience. In every culture Milgram studied, participants found culturally specific ways to justify their actions. Germans talked about scientific progress and following proper procedures. Italians emphasized respect for education and expertise. Americans focused on contractual obligations and helping scientific research. Each culture provided its own moral vocabulary for the same fundamentally troubling behavior. Now, think about this in the context of our interconnected world today. When a whistleblower in one country exposes government surveillance, when protesters in another nation challenge authoritarian rule, when employees anywhere speak up against corporate malfeasance, they're fighting against this same deep-seated human tendency toward obedience that Milgram documented across cultures. The courage required to resist authority isn't just individual, it's countercultural in the most literal sense. As we move forward in our exploration of Milgram's groundbreaking work, keep this cultural dimension in mind. Obedience to authority isn't an American problem or a German problem or any single nation's failing. It's a human problem that transcends borders, languages, and belief systems, which makes understanding it not just academically interesting, but absolutely essential for anyone who wants to live as a conscious, moral being in our complex modern world. So we've journeyed through Milgram's shocking laboratory findings, watched ordinary people deliver what they believed were dangerous electric shocks, and now we arrive at perhaps the most unsettling question of all. What does this mean for the world we actually live in? Because here's the thing about Milgram's experiments that keeps me up at night sometimes. They weren't conducted in some dystopian fantasy. They happened in New Haven, Connecticut, with regular folks who went home afterward to have dinner with their families. Think about this for a moment. If 2/3 of people will harm a stranger simply because someone in a lab coat tells them to, what does that say about the invisible forces shaping our daily lives? Milgram himself was haunted by this question, and his insights cut right to the heart of how societies function, how they maintain order, and how they can go terribly wrong. Let's start with something we all experience but rarely question: the morning commute. Picture millions of people waking up at roughly the same time, following the same routes, sitting in traffic or crowded trains, all because some abstract system has determined this is when work begins. Now, there's nothing inherently magical about 9 o'clock in the morning, yet entire civilizations organize around these arbitrary schedules. We obey not because we've carefully reasoned through the logic, but because that's simply how things are done. Milgram would recognize this as the agentic state in action. We've surrendered our individual decision-making to the larger system. But here's where it gets really interesting. This same mechanism that gets us to work on time is the exact same psychological process that enabled some of history's darkest chapters. The Holocaust wasn't carried out by cartoon villains twirling their mustaches. It was implemented by bureaucrats, clerks, train conductors, and ordinary citizens who had learned to follow orders without question. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, and Milgram's experiments showed us the psychological machinery that makes such banality possible. Consider how this plays out in modern corporate life. How many times have you seen good people implement policies they privately disagree with? The middle manager who knows the layoffs are unnecessary but processes them anyway. The accountant who spots the questionable practices but stays quiet because it's not their department. the engineer who has safety concerns but doesn't want to rock the boat. Each person can rationalize their compliance. They're just doing their job, following protocol, maintaining their career. Sound familiar? Now think about the digital age we're living in. Social media algorithms determine what information billions of people see each day, yet most of us have no idea how these systems work or who's making the decisions behind them. We scroll through our feeds, absorbing whatever the algorithm serves us, rarely questioning why we're seeing what we're seeing. It's a form of technological obedience that would have fascinated Milgram. We're following the commands of machines programmed by people we'll never meet. The implications extend far beyond individual behavior into the very structure of how we organize society. Democracy itself relies on a delicate balance between obedience and rebellion. We need people to follow laws, pay taxes, and respect institutions, but we also need them to question authority when it overreaches. The challenge is that the same psychological mechanisms that make someone a good citizen, respect for authority, desire to fit in, trust in experts, can also make them vulnerable to manipulation. Milgram observed something profound about modern life. We live in what he called a society of experts. Unlike our ancestors who might have known their village leader personally, we're constantly deferring to distant authorities we'll never meet. The doctor we see for 10 minutes, the financial advisor managing our retirement, the politicians we vote for based on 30-second commercials. We have to trust these systems because modern life is too complex for any individual to understand completely. But this trust creates vulnerabilities. What's particularly chilling is how normal this all feels. The participants in Milgram's experiments weren't monsters. They were people like us, trying to be helpful, trying to do the right thing. They'd been taught to respect authority, to be polite, to fulfill their commitments. These are generally good qualities, the kind of traits we want to instill in our children. Yet under the right circumstances, these same virtues became the pathway to cruelty. So where does this leave us? Milgram wasn't advocating for anarchy or the complete rejection of authority. Society needs structure, coordination, and leadership to function. The key insight is developing what we might call intelligent obedience. The ability to distinguish between legitimate authority that serves human flourishing and authority that exploits our natural tendency to comply. This means teaching ourselves and our children to ask uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from this rule? What happens if I say no? What would I do if I were truly free to choose? It means recognizing that sometimes the most moral thing you can do is disappoint someone who expects your obedience. As we move forward, we'll explore how individuals can maintain their moral compass in systems designed to override it. Because understanding the problem is only the first step towards solving it. You know, when you drop a bombshell like Milgram's obedience experiments into the world of psychology, you can't expect everyone to just sit back and sip their tea quietly. From the moment those first shocking results were published, the academic world erupted into debates that continue to this day. Picture a dinner party where someone brings up politics, and suddenly everyone has an opinion they're dying to share. That's essentially what happened with Milgram's work, except the stakes were much higher than awkward family gatherings. The first wave of criticism came crashing down like a tsunami, and much of it centered on ethics. Diana Baumrind, a developmental psychologist at Berkeley, led the charge with what became one of the most famous critiques in psychology's history. She argued that Milgram had essentially traumatized his participants, putting them through psychological torture in the name of science. Think about this for a moment. Imagine you're one of those teachers who went all the way to 450 volts, believing you'd seriously harmed another human being. Even after the deception was revealed, wouldn't you carry some psychological scars from discovering what you were capable of under pressure? Baumrind painted a vivid picture of participants leaving the laboratory potently disturbed, their self-image shattered like glass hitting concrete. She questioned whether any scientific knowledge was worth that kind of human cost. It's like asking whether we should burn down a forest to study fire behavior. The metaphor might be dramatic, but the ethical concerns were absolutely real and valid. Milgram, ever the meticulous researcher, fought back with data. He conducted follow-up interviews and surveys, discovering that the vast majority of participants reported being glad they had taken part in the study. 84% said they were happy to have participated, and many described it as a valuable learning experience. But here's where it gets interesting. Does the fact that people say they're okay with something afterward make it ethically acceptable? It's like asking someone who survived a dangerous stunt if they'd recommend it to others. Their perspective might be skewed by the relief of having made it through. Then came the methodological critics, armed with spreadsheets and statistical analyses, ready to tear apart Milgram's experimental design. Gina Perry, an Australian psychologist, spent years digging through Milgram's archived materials and emerged with some troubling discoveries. She found evidence that many participants had figured out the deception, that the supposedly standardized procedures were actually quite variable, and that some of the most dramatic cases might have been outliers rather than representative examples. Picture a magic trick where you suddenly notice the wires and mirrors. That's what Perry's analysis did to Milgram's work for many people. She argued that participants weren't blindly following orders, but were often trying to be helpful in what they recognized as an experimental situation. It's the difference between someone genuinely believing they're hurting another person and someone playing along with what they suspect is an elaborate performance. But perhaps the most fascinating criticism came from those who questioned the study's relevance to real-world atrocities. How do we leap from a laboratory in New Haven to the gas chambers of Auschwitz? Critics argued that this comparison was not just inappropriate but potentially dangerous, as it might lead us to excuse real perpetrators by suggesting they were simply following orders. Think about the difference between a controlled laboratory setting, where participants can leave at any time and are surrounded by the trappings of legitimate science, versus the chaotic, threatening environment of actual genocide. Modern technology has opened up new avenues for both criticism and validation. Virtual reality experiments have attempted to replicate Milgram's findings without the ethical concerns, and the results have been mixed. Some studies find similar obedience rates, while others suggest that when people truly believe they're causing harm, compliance drops dramatically. It's like the difference between playing a violent video game and actually being in combat. The psychological experience might be fundamentally different. The cultural context criticism has also gained traction over the decades. Milgram's participants were mostly white, middle-class Americans in the early 1960s, a group with particular cultural attitudes toward authority and scientific institutions. Would we see the same results today in our more skeptical, individualistic culture? Would we see different patterns among people from cultures that place different values on hierarchy and compliance? What makes these controversies so enduring is that they force us to grapple with fundamental questions about human nature, scientific ethics, and the pursuit of knowledge. Every criticism of Milgram's work opens up new questions. If we can't study extreme human behavior in controlled settings, how do we understand it? If we sanitize our research to avoid all potential harm, do we lose the ability to uncover uncomfortable truths about ourselves? As we settle into considering these complex debates, remember that the very existence of such passionate criticism speaks to the profound impact of Milgram's work. Whether you see him as a pioneering scientist or an unethical researcher, there's no denying that his experiments continue to shape how we think about authority, compliance, and the dark corners of human behavior. You know, there's something fascinating about how certain scientific discoveries just refuse to stay locked away in dusty academic journals. They escape into the world and start changing how we think about everything from workplace dynamics to political movements. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments are exactly that kind of breakthrough, and their legacy continues to ripple through our understanding of human nature more than 6 decades later. Picture this. You're sitting in a psychology class in 1961, and your professor describes an experiment where ordinary people deliver what they believe are dangerous electric shocks to strangers, simply because someone in a lab coat tells them to. Most students would probably think, well, that's interesting, but what does it really tell us about the real world? What they couldn't have predicted was how this single study would become one of the most referenced, debated, and influential pieces of research in all of social science. The immediate impact was like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples started small but grew enormous. Within just a few years, Milgram's findings were being cited not just in psychology textbooks, but in discussions about the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, corporate scandals, and countless other situations where people seemed to abandon their moral compass when following orders. Think about it this way. Before Milgram, we had a tendency to explain evil actions by assuming evil people. His work forced us to confront a much more uncomfortable truth, that evil could emerge from the interaction between ordinary people and corrupting situations. Now, consider how this shifted our entire approach to understanding human behavior. Suddenly, psychologists weren't just asking, what kind of person would do this? But what kind of situation makes ordinary people capable of this? This fundamental shift helped birth what we now call situational psychology, and it's everywhere once you start looking for it. When companies implement anonymous whistleblower hotlines, they're acknowledging Milgram's insight that good people can be pressured into silence by authority structures. When military organizations emphasize the importance of questioning illegal orders, they're building safeguards against the very obedience mechanisms Milgram revealed. The study's influence on our legal system has been particularly profound. Defense attorneys began invoking what became known as the Milgram defense, arguing that their clients were simply following orders rather than acting from personal malice. Now, this doesn't excuse criminal behavior, but it does complicate our understanding of responsibility and culpability. Judges and juries had to grapple with questions that seemed almost philosophical. If someone commits a harmful act under authority pressure, how do we balance personal responsibility with situational influence? But here's where it gets really interesting. Milgram's work didn't just change how we think about obedience. It revolutionized how we conduct psychological research itself. The ethical concerns raised by his experiments led to the development of institutional review boards and informed consent procedures that now govern all human research. It's almost ironic that a study about blind obedience to authority helped create systems designed to protect people from researcher authority. Every time a participant in a psychology study signs a consent form explaining their rights, they're benefiting from lessons learned from Milgram's controversial methods. The corporate world has been particularly shaped by these insights, often in ways that might surprise you. Modern management training frequently includes discussions about creating psychologically safe environments where employees feel comfortable challenging decisions. When tech companies implement blameless postmortems after system failures, they're trying to counteract the authority gradients that might prevent junior engineers from speaking up about problems. The entire field of organizational psychology has been enriched by understanding how hierarchies can suppress critical thinking and moral reasoning. Think about how this applies to our current digital age. Social media platforms grapple with content moderation decisions that echo Milgram's findings. When moderators are told to remove certain types of content, how do we ensure they're not just blindly following algorithmic orders, but actually thinking critically about context and nuance? The tech industry's struggles with these questions show how relevant Milgram's insights remain in our interconnected world. Educational institutions have also been transformed by this legacy. Progressive schools now emphasize critical thinking and questioning authority as core skills, not just academic subjects. When teachers encourage students to ask why, instead of just accepting information, they're building psychological resistance to the kind of unthinking obedience Milgram documented. This shift represents a fundamental change in how we prepare young people to navigate a complex world filled with competing authorities and moral challenges. Perhaps most importantly, Milgram's work has given us a vocabulary for discussing these issues. Terms like agentic state, moral disengagement, and diffusion of responsibility have entered not just academic discourse but popular conversation. When journalists analyze political scandals or corporate malfeasance, they often reference these concepts to help explain how good people can participate in harmful systems. The enduring power of Milgram's legacy lies not in providing simple answers, but in forcing us to ask better questions about authority, responsibility, and the conditions that bring out the best and worst in human nature. As we navigate an increasingly complex world filled with competing authorities and moral ambiguities, his insights remain as relevant as ever, reminding us that understanding obedience is ultimately about understanding ourselves. As we reach the final pages of Milgram's groundbreaking work, settling into our chairs with perhaps our third cup of coffee, it's worth pausing to absorb the full weight of what we've discovered together. The experiments are over, the data analyzed, the participants long since returned to their everyday lives, but the questions Milgram raised continue to echo through our modern world with an urgency that feels almost prophetic. Think about this for a moment. When Milgram first conceived these experiments in the early 1960s, the world was still grappling with the horrors of the Holocaust. People desperately wanted to believe that such systematic cruelty could only emerge from a uniquely evil society, that ordinary Americans or Europeans could never participate in such atrocities. Milgram's work shattered that comforting illusion like a stone through glass, revealing that the capacity for destructive obedience lurks within all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. But here's where Milgram's final reflections become particularly fascinating and, honestly, a bit unsettling. He doesn't end his book with simple warnings about avoiding authority figures or rejecting all forms of obedience. Instead, he presents us with a paradox that feels remarkably relevant to our current moment. We need obedience to function as a society, yet this very same obedience can lead us down the darkest paths imaginable. Consider how this plays out in our daily lives today. When you follow traffic laws, you're being obedient to authority, and that's generally a good thing that keeps society functioning. When healthcare workers follow protocols during a pandemic, that obedience can save lives. When employees follow safety regulations, that compliance prevents accidents. Obedience, in countless ways, is the invisible glue that holds our complex modern world together. Yet Milgram reminds us that this same psychological mechanism that makes us stop at red lights and follow workplace procedures is precisely what allowed ordinary people in his laboratory to continue shocking a stranger despite their moral qualms. The person administering those shocks wasn't transformed into a monster. They were simply following the same psychological pathways that govern much of our social behavior. Now, think about the digital age we're living in. Milgram could never have imagined social media algorithms, but his insights feel eerily prescient when we consider how readily people share information without verification, simply because it comes from sources they perceive as authoritative. How many of us have forwarded a news article or reposted content without deeply questioning it, simply because it came from someone we trust or respect? The lab coat has been replaced by the verified checkmark, but the psychology remains remarkably similar. Milgram's final thoughts also grapple with what he calls the agentic state versus the autonomous state. When we're in the agentic state, we see ourselves as agents of someone else's will rather than autonomous moral actors. We become, in essence, instruments rather than individuals. The terrifying efficiency of this psychological shift is that it doesn't require us to become evil. It simply requires us to stop seeing ourselves as fully responsible for our actions. This concept feels particularly relevant when we consider modern corporate structures, military hierarchies, or even social media dynamics. How often do we find ourselves saying, "I was just following orders," or "I was just doing my job," or "everyone else was doing it"? These phrases aren't just excuses, they're windows into a fundamental shift in how we perceive our own moral agency. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Milgram's concluding thoughts is his recognition that awareness alone isn't enough. Simply knowing about the power of obedience doesn't automatically immunize us against it. The participants who scored highest on measures of moral sensitivity were just as likely to continue shocking the victim as those who scored lower. Knowledge and good intentions, while valuable, aren't sufficient shields against the psychological forces Milgram identified. So where does this leave us? Milgram suggests that our best defense lies not in rejecting authority entirely, which would be both impossible and undesirable, but in cultivating what we might call thoughtful disobedience. This means developing the capacity to pause, even in the midst of authoritative pressure, and ask ourselves, what am I really being asked to do here? Does this align with my values? Am I acting as an autonomous moral agent, or have I slipped into that agentic state? The beauty of Milgram's final reflections is that they don't offer us simple answers or easy comfort. Instead, they challenge us to live with greater awareness of our own psychological vulnerabilities while still participating meaningfully in society. They remind us that moral courage isn't about grand gestures of defiance. It's about the daily practice of maintaining our capacity for independent moral judgment, even when it's easier to simply go along. As we close this remarkable book and perhaps pour one last cup of coffee, we're left not with despair about human nature, but with a deeper appreciation for the ongoing work of being human in a complex social world. Milgram's gift to us isn't just knowledge about obedience. It's an invitation to live more consciously, more courageously, and more compassionately in the face of the eternal tension between individual conscience and social cooperation. Stanley Milgram's Obedience to Authority is a profound exploration of the human tendency to follow orders, even when those orders go against personal morals. Through his famous and controversial experiments, Milgram unveils the complex dynamics between authority and conformity, evoking critical reflections on ethical behavior, societal norms, and individual responsibility. The book challenges readers to consider the potential for harm when authority goes unchecked and highlights the power of situational influences on human behavior. Here are some key actionable takeaways. 1. Question authority. Always assess the credibility and intent of the authority figures in your life. Apply critical thinking to evaluate decisions, especially when they conflict with your personal values. Start incredibly small by questioning everyday requests and build your confidence in seeking justifications. 2. Personal responsibility. Own your decisions, even in hierarchical structures. Recognize when you're deferring responsibility to another and actively choose to remain accountable for your actions. Begin by reflecting on past decisions where you relinquished control and consider how you could have acted differently. 3. Understand situational influence. Be aware of how environments and contexts shape behavior. Practically, when in a group setting, take a moment to pause and reflect on whether your actions align with your values or if they're simply a reaction to external pressures. Be patient with yourself as you learn to identify these influences. 4. Build moral courage. Develop the strength to stand by your principles, even when it's uncomfortable. Start small by speaking up in low-stakes situations to build the habit of acting in accordance with your ethics. Over time, your comfort with expressing dissent will grow. 5. Foster empathy. Cultivate an empathetic understanding of those around you, recognizing how authority dynamics can impact others. Engage in active listening and consider perspectives that differ from your own. This practice not only enriches personal relationships, but also strengthens your ability to resist unjust directives. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.